The looting of India, how $45 trillion was stolen. When the British arrived in India in 1600, they saw a land of unimaginable wealth, thriving industries, and powerful civilizations. India at the time contributed 27% of the world's GDP, making it one of the richest economies on earth. By 1947, when the British finally left, India's economy had collapsed to less than 4% of global GDP. Famine had killed millions, industries had been wiped out, and an estimated $45 trillion had been siphoned away to Britain. This was not an accident, nor was it due to economic mismanagement. It was a calculated, systematic looting of India, engineered through brutal taxation, destruction of industries, mass starvation, and outright theft of gold, diamonds, and treasures from Indian temples and palaces. So how did Britain steal $45 trillion from India? How did they reduce one of the world's wealthiest civilizations to poverty? This is the real story of economic exploitation, hidden in history books. The British did not just rule India, they turned it into a financial engine for their empire, systematically extracting wealth and transferring it to Britain through various means, including taxation, trade manipulation, destruction of industries, looting of natural resources, and forced famines. In 1867, Indian economist Dadabhai Naoroji was the first to expose the systematic wealth transfer through his drain of wealth theory. He argued that British policies were designed to extract wealth from India without any reinvestment into the local economy. His estimates were later supported by modern economist Utsa Patnaik, who calculated that Britain drained approximately $45 trillion from India between 1765 and 1938. This vast sum funded Britain's industrial revolution, military expansion, and global trade dominance, while leaving India in poverty and economic stagnation. The British government and historians often try to downplay the numbers, but their own records confirm that India's wealth fueled Britain's rise as a global superpower. Unfair taxation, the system that crushed Indian farmers. Before British rule, Indian taxation was moderate and flexible, designed to support local economies, irrigation projects, and rural development. Indian rulers adjusted tax rates based on agricultural output, ensuring that farmers could survive during droughts and bad harvests. However, the British replaced this system with rigid, exploitative taxation that prioritized their revenue collection over human lives. The Permanent Settlement Act, 1793, introduced in Bengal, this law forced farmers to pay a fixed land tax, regardless of agricultural success or failure. If a farmer couldn't pay, their land was seized and auctioned to British landlords. Riyatwari system, South India. This system forced peasants to pay land taxes directly to the British government instead of local rulers. Farmers were given no relief during poor harvests, and unpaid taxes led to immediate eviction. Double taxation for Indian goods. While British traders paid little to no taxes, Indian merchants were heavily taxed, making their businesses unprofitable. By the early 19th century, over 30 million Indian farmers had lost their land and become landless laborers, forced to work on British-owned plantations and factories for low wages. Even during famine years, the British demanded full tax payments, pushing millions into starvation and homelessness. This system was not just about collecting revenue. It was designed to permanently impoverish India while ensuring that all profits flowed to Britain. Destruction of Indian industries, Britain's economic warfare. Before British rule, India was a leading manufacturing hub, producing high-quality textiles, shipbuilding, and ironwork that were exported worldwide. British merchants, unable to compete with India's superior products, deliberately dismantled Indian industries to eliminate competition. Textile industry, India's global leadership erased. In the 18th century, India was the largest textile producer in the world, exporting fine muslin, silk, and cotton to Europe, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. To destroy this industry, the British imposed heavy tariffs on Indian textiles while allowing British-made cloth to enter duty-free, banned Indian cotton exports to prevent competition with British textile mills, forced Indian farmers to grow raw cotton for British factories while stopping them from making finished textiles. Weavers were deliberately oppressed. Some historical records suggest that British officers cut off the thumbs of skilled weavers to prevent them from producing high-quality cloth. By 1850, India's textile industry had collapsed, leaving millions of weavers unemployed and forcing India to import British-made textiles. Cities like Dhaka, once a global textile hub, fell into economic ruin and were never able to recover. Shipbuilding, a once thriving industry, banned Indian shipbuilders were renowned for producing strong, durable ships, supplying fleets to Arab, Chinese, and European merchants. However, to protect British shipyards, the British banned Indian-built ships from international trade, making it illegal for Indian ships to compete. Passed laws restricting Indian shipbuilding, forcing Indian craftsmen to work for British-owned docks instead of their own businesses. Used Indian timber and labor to build ships for the British Navy, turning India into a supplier instead of a competitor. By the mid-19th century, India's shipbuilding industry was dead, and Britain had successfully monopolized global naval trade. Steel and metalwork, India's technological edge. Removed Indian wootz steel was famous worldwide and was used to make the legendary Damascus swords. But the British banned local steel production and shut down iron foundries, seized control of India's iron ore mines and shipped raw materials to Britain for processing, made it illegal for Indians to own advanced metalworking tools, ensuring that all industrial development remained in British hands. Before British rule, India was one of the largest trading economies in the world, known for its high-quality textiles, spices, steel, and shipbuilding industries. Indian goods were in high demand across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe, and the country had a positive trade balance, meaning it exported more than it imported, accumulating wealth in gold and silver. However, under British rule, this system was completely reversed. India was forced into a colonial economy where all profits flowed to Britain, while Indian industries collapsed. The British manipulated trade policies at every level to ensure that India remained a supplier of raw materials and a consumer of British-made goods. India was forced to supply raw materials to British factories for free or at artificially low rates. One of the first economic changes the British made was turning India into a source of cheap raw materials for their growing industries in England. Indian farmers were forced to grow cash crops like cotton, indigo, and opium instead of food grains. This made India dependent on imported food, leading to famines when crops failed. Raw materials were exported to Britain at dirt-cheap rates, often through government-enforced monopolies. The British banned Indian industries from processing these raw materials, ensuring that the value addition happened in British factories, not in India. For example, Indian cotton was shipped to Manchester and Lancashire, processed into textiles, and then sold back to Indians at high prices. This destroyed local Indian weaving and textile businesses, forcing millions of artisans and laborers into poverty and unemployment. British goods were dumped in Indian markets at high prices, destroying local industries. Once India was stripped of its manufacturing power, British merchants flooded the Indian market with cheap, machine-made goods, particularly textiles from Britain's factories. These products were sold at artificially low prices, making it impossible for Indian craftsmen to compete. Indian artisans, once famous for their high-quality hand-woven fabrics, were pushed out of business as their products became too expensive compared to cheap British imports. Entire cities that once thrived on textile production, such as Dhaka, Surat, and Murshidabad, collapsed economically, and their populations fell into poverty. The same pattern happened in metalwork, shipbuilding, and handicrafts as British manufacturers took over India's domestic markets, leaving Indian producers with no buyers. Heavy tariffs were placed on Indian-made products, preventing global competition. To further cripple Indian industries, the British imposed steep tariffs and trade restrictions on Indian-made goods. Indian textiles and manufactured goods were heavily taxed if they were exported to Britain or Europe, making them too expensive to compete in global markets. Meanwhile, British goods entered India duty-free, meaning that Indians were forced to buy British products instead of their own locally made goods. This policy transformed India from a global exporter into a captive market, where Indians had no choice but to buy British-made goods at high prices. By 1870, India, which had once been a manufacturing powerhouse, was now fully dependent on British imports, while millions of Indian workers had lost their livelihoods. How this rigged system kept India poor and Britain rich. This deliberate trade manipulation ensured that all wealth flowed out of India and into Britain. Britain got free raw materials, cheap labor, and a guaranteed market for its goods. India lost its industries, its ability to manufacture, and its economic independence. Any attempt by Indian businesses to revive local industries was crushed through laws, tariffs, and market manipulation. This system ensured that Britain profited at every stage, while India became an underdeveloped, dependent economy, struggling with unemployment, poverty, and famine, a fate designed and enforced by colonial trade policies. Beyond economic exploitation and trade manipulation, the British outright looted India's natural wealth, seizing vast amounts of gold, diamonds, temple treasures, and royal artifacts. This was not limited to individual acts of plunder, but was part of a systematic, state-sponsored operation that stripped India of centuries of accumulated wealth. From the annexation of Punjab and Mysore to the revolt of 1857 and the destruction of Indian kingdoms, the British used military force, deceit, and coercion to rob India of its most valuable assets. These stolen treasures ended up in the British crown jewels, British museums, private collections, and the royal treasury, where they remain to this day, despite repeated demands for their return. The Koh-i-Noor diamond, Britain's most infamous theft. The Koh-i-Noor diamond, one of the largest and most famous diamonds in the world, became the ultimate symbol of British colonial theft. The diamond, originally mined in India's Golconda region, was passed down through various Indian dynasties, including the Mughals, the Persians, and the Sikhs. In 1849, after the British annexed Punjab, the 10-year-old Maharaj Duleep Singh was forced to sign the Treaty of Lahore, surrendering the Koh-i-Noor to Queen Victoria. The diamond was shipped to England, where it was recut and placed in the British crown jewels, permanently altering its original form. To justify the theft, British officials claimed the diamond was gifted to them, even though it was clearly taken under duress from a child ruler. To this day, the Koh-i-Noor remains in the British crown jewels, despite repeated demands from India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Iran for its return. The British government has refused, claiming that the diamond was acquired legally, a statement that ignores the historical reality of British imperial coercion. Looting of Indian temples and gold reserves. Temples in India were not just places of worship, they were also centers of vast economic wealth, housing gold idols, jewelry, and donations accumulated over centuries. The British, realizing the enormous financial reserves stored in these temples, systematically raided them, stripping them of priceless artifacts and gold. South Indian temples, such as those in Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and Andhra Pradesh, were some of the worst affected, as they contained centuries-old treasures from Chola, Vijayanagara, and Pallava dynasties. In 1858, following the suppression of the revolt of 1857, British forces looted the Mughal treasury in Delhi, seizing priceless gold artifacts, royal jewelry, and the famed peacock throne of Shah Jahan, which was later dismantled and disappeared into British collections. Golden idols, emerald-studded crowns, silver ornaments, and temple jewelry were shipped to Britain, either melted down for bullion or placed in British museums. Between 1800 and 1947, Britain took an estimated 200 million pounds of gold from India, draining the country's wealth reserves and weakening its financial stability. Beyond temple loot, several Indian royal treasures were stolen during British military campaigns. Tipu Sultan's treasures. After the British defeated Tipu Sultan in 1799, his personal sword, golden throne, and jewel-encrusted weapons were looted and sent to Britain. Many of these artifacts are still in British museums or private collections. The Sultanganj Buddha, a 7-foot-tall, 500 kilograms bronze statue from the 6th century, was stolen from Bihar and is now displayed in Birmingham Museum. The Amravati marbles, priceless Buddhist sculptures from the 2nd century BCE, looted from Andhra Pradesh's Amravati Stupa, were taken to the British Museum, London. The looting of India's treasures was not just about wealth. It was about erasing India's historical and cultural heritage, leaving future generations with empty spaces where priceless artifacts once stood. Famines in India were not just natural disasters. They were engineered economic tools used by the British to extract even more wealth while ensuring that India remained weak and dependent. Before British rule, Indian kingdoms had well-developed famine management systems, including grain storage, tax relief, and local charity networks, to help the population survive during droughts. However, under British rule, these systems were dismantled and replaced with a brutal revenue-first policy that prioritized British profits over Indian lives. When famine struck, instead of providing relief, the British continued demanding taxes, exporting food, and punishing those who couldn't pay. As a result, millions of Indians died, not because of food shortages, but because of deliberate colonial policies. The Great Bengal Famine, 1770. 10 million dead, but taxes continued. One of the first major famines under British rule, this disaster wiped out a third of Bengal's population, yet the British did nothing to prevent it. The famine was caused by a severe drought that led to massive crop failures across Bengal. Instead of helping the starving population, the British forced farmers to continue growing indigo and opium for export instead of food crops. Taxes were not reduced. The British actually increased tax collection by 10% during the famine. Millions of people died from starvation, but grain was still being exported to Britain for profit. A British official at the time, Warren Hastings, the Governor-General of India, admitted in his reports that Britain was fully aware of the mass starvation, but saw it as a necessary sacrifice to maintain revenue. This famine set a dangerous precedent. It proved that Britain could extract revenue even while millions of Indians died, and it would only get worse in the following centuries. The Bengal Famine of 1943, Churchill's crimes against humanity. One of the worst famines in human history, the Bengal Famine of 1943 was not caused by drought. It was a direct result of British war policies during World War II. Over 3 million people died, yet British officials deliberately refused to provide relief, even though India had enough food supplies. At the time, India had bumper rice harvests, but Churchill ordered that food be exported to Britain and British troops, leaving Bengalis to starve. British officials blocked humanitarian aid from Canada and the US, claiming that providing food relief to India was not a priority. Trains carrying grain were diverted from starving Bengal to British military stockpiles. When British officials warned Winston Churchill that millions were dying, his response was, "If food is so scarce, why hasn't Gandhi died yet?" This was not just indifference, it was a deliberate policy of starvation. Historians estimate that millions of lives could have been saved if Britain had allowed food imports or redirected a fraction of its stockpiles to India. But instead, the British government let Indians die while stockpiling food for European use. The pattern of British-induced famines. The 1770 and 1943 famines were not isolated incidents. They were part of a recurring pattern of British colonial governance. Between 1765 and 1947, at least 12 major famines struck India under British rule, killing over 60 million people. The British continued exporting food from India even during the worst famine years, ensuring that Indians remained weak and dependent on colonial rule. Instead of famine relief, British officials often blamed Indians for their own starvation, arguing that they were overpopulated and that famine was a natural check on their numbers. These famines were not accidental disasters. They were tools of economic warfare used by Britain to extract wealth, control the population, and maintain absolute power over India. By the time the British left in 1947, India had been economically devastated. From 27% of global GDP in 1700, India had fallen to less than 4%. Over 60 million Indians had died due to famines caused by British policies. $45 trillion had been drained, money that could have built modern infrastructure, schools, and industries. The British did not develop India. They looted it, stripped it of its industries, starved its people, and left behind a broken nation. In the next episode, we uncover how the British used divide and rule to control India for nearly 200 years.